Hi. The term immersive a lot about museums increasingly, and we've just had an immersive experience in Denmark. I've just been here 2 weeks. I feel like I could give a tour of Denmark, never mind doing a tour de Denmark. But what a fantastic experience that was. However, having said that, this first paper is really based in the UK. It's based on the experience, and the UK is a good case study because it has had quite an embedded practice of participation and social inclusion for some decades, as you know. So this is looking at the impact of that. And then later on, I'm very, very pleased that I will also have the chance to reflect on how it applies in Denmark. Okay, I deliberately used this slide at the beginning. Maybe I like being provocative. But this is the Occupy movement in London. It was a poster they were using. And if you can't read, I guess you can read it all. We apologize for inconvenience during essential global improvement works. So the point being, what's the role of the institution and is it shifting? So when we're talking about architecture and the inside and the exhibition making, how does it relate to the shifting role of the museum? So, last year, I pulled up in a taxi outside a shiny new contemporary art gallery in the UK. Now, I'm going to show you a few slides of new museums in the UK. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but there was a rush of new building with Millennium funding over the last 10 years. And it was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. They were usually built in areas for urban regeneration, in areas that had high unemployment, and there were intercultural problems, and so they built these new museums. And I really am happy to be following Peter, because the issue here is what's the relationship between this building and the location, most of which are very challenging areas. So I pulled up in this taxi, and when I arrived there, the building had these concrete slopes leading down to everything was on an angle. It was all very impressive. It looked like nothing else in the town. It looked like it landed from outer space. But what was really impressive was that the whole front of the gallery was absolutely packed with young people using the slopes for skateboarding. Now, I got out of the taxi thinking, fantastic. I'm here to look at participation in this institution. I went inside the building, and I was met by the director and the senior staff, and I said, look at this. This is fantastic. They're all here. And they said, I know. What a problem. They're starting to come inside. So now, what's the gallery there for? This is the question. They saw the young people as a problem, a rogue element. I think there's a lot we need to think about in terms of how did people become a rogue element in these buildings? They're interrupting the clean design of the building. And I want to talk about the museum embracing life, which is really messy and messes up those designs. One staff member at a prominent museum in London said to me, said this: life is messy, controversial, fluid, contentious, lots of things a museum has difficulty with. So I think symbolically we keep it outside the door. Okay, the bottom line is, and in the UK I think we really feel this acutely, we live in a troubled world in which the future is increasingly precarious. For these young people, they are, as one recent newspaper called them, the precariat, meaning they are skateboarding into an uncertain future, out of work, or higher education, inaccessible higher education, and they are bearing the brunt of what happened to the economy. They're not alone, not just in the UK. Meanwhile, The dynamics of change and its prevention are represented within the dialectics of the museum's social relations. They always are. The civil society space of the museum is created by the relations enacted within it and embodied within it, as is the case in any social or civil society space in society. So in the UK, over the past decade, there were all of these new buildings, which beg the question, who or what are they for? This is a friend of mine. I like talking to him. He's the deputy director of something called Grisdale Arts in the Lake District in England. Incredibly interesting social experiment in public participation. Grisdale Arts has become very vocal in its critique of public spaces, museums as public spaces, and in design and in exhibitions in terms of how they keep people out of active engagement. So he's saying, again, are we moving, or should we be moving, beyond a very 19th century concept of the spectacle that is saying we provide for you? I thought it was incredibly telling at one museum here, which I'll refer to later, where they call the central arc, or the pathway, the catwalk. Where you look at everything. Actually, they aren't looking at you, you're looking at everything around you, but you have a linear progression. You're not engaged. So here we have this 19th century concept, and I think it's a fantastically interesting question to ask ourselves. Do museums need to change, and are museums changing fast enough? Is it possible that despite, or even because of their architecture, they're stuck in a model of social improvement here that has little connection with the social realities surrounding them? So the idea, if we build it, it will, just by its impact, have a relationship on that place. It'll raise aspirations. The mere presence as social improvement. It's a redundant concept of social change. And you know, I've worked with a lot of young people, and they will say to you, thanks very much, but I don't care. So just as I've done in many times in recent years on these research projects across the UK, I look at what is to be seen when we go inside. Has there been a change in exhibitionary practice? So here's some more of these museums. They start to look oddly similar when you see a lot of them. Indeed, no offense to architects, sorry. Indeed, it can certainly be claimed that the museum does now, in the UK certainly, embrace contemporary social issues, uncomfortable issues, such as climate change, poverty, race, racism, prejudice, and discrimination. For example, I'm sorry, I'm going to just skip through this so we can get back to this. In my last museum, University Museum, we thought we were extremely courageous in tackling the subject of race and the museum's role in perpetuating racial discrimination through its scientific racism and its whole history to do with the slave trade, the collections, all of that. We worked on a project that was very progressive. We were working as a co-production with leaders of activist groups in the local communities, and we thought we'll put this project together and it will be an example. In fact, I've written quite a bit about this. If you're interested, the paper is called Legacies of Prejudice. It's available online. What happened was a really stark reminder that while the museum stays in control of the subject and brings people in as participants in our project, what matters to them still gets managed out. So in fact, we ran into great anger because what was happening is they wanted to talk about contemporary racism and the museum's continuing role and its symbolic role in relation to the neighborhoods right around it. And they wanted to talk about it in a real way, and in terms of how it felt, the emotions, the impact. They didn't want to talk about racism as an abstract concept. They wanted to talk about what racism feels like now in the UK. So that was a really good learning opportunity for the museum. I'm very, very keen on reflective practice. It's bandied about, but when we do these things, how much time we build in to look at what actually happened, and asking the people with whom we worked, how did that feel for you? I don't know how you change anything unless you build that time in. These were images from the exhibition. And I mean, it was, you know, on the one hand, here, this is something I've done quite a lot. On the one hand, the museum won a lot of awards for its practice, but we were still in control of the story. We were not actually letting people in to make it relevant, for them to make it relevant to their own lived experience. So even in a progressive practice, so-called, we're still in control. There's a center-periphery model. We are at the center controlling the story. At the Science Museum, where my colleague Alex comes from, there was an exhibition in 2009 on man-made climate change, and it faced a backlash as visitors felt it told people what to think rather than allowing them to draw their own conclusions. And there was a lot of talk about this. The Museums Association talked about it. They said the environment is one of the things the public told us they were happy for museums to campaign on. It's not seen as controversial, and so on. It's more about starting the discussion, and that's fine. Yet, another, I'm going to move on. This is the Museums Association and their comment about people. It's more about starting the discussion, and that is a role for the museum to take. However, is it enough? When the museum holds the subject and interprets it, is it enough? Bridget McKenzie, who is a commentator, very active commentator, disagrees. She says, we're not looking at how urgent these subjects are and what our responsibility is in relation to them. How we engage with them becomes absolutely urgent and important, and it is our social responsibility. And, you know, it's engaging with people's fears and people's feelings in relation to these subjects. So is it the responsibility of the museum to analyze these issues in an informed but dispassionate way, or should the museum take a stand? There are certainly museums now who are taking a stand. There's a group of museums that are human rights, the Federation of Human Rights Museums, who see themselves as having a role, Liverpool Museum is one of them, in taking a stand around some key human rights issues. We talked about passion a little while ago. Here's passion. After we did the race exhibition in Manchester, we had a big public debate on are museums racist? And that came out of a response from local visitors to the exhibition from those communities saying, you're still not getting it. So we had a big open debate, and we had people telling us, I'm not an academic, but sometimes my problem is with academia. It's like people who don't talk about racism, but the symptoms of racism. It's like the high concept of racism. Racism is about human beings. It's not about analyzing it in an exhibition. It's the feelings we have inside, the hatred, the palpable feelings. That's the racism I'm interested in. So what I feel increasingly important, how can we tell that story if it's not a collaboration or a cooperation with those people who are on the receiving end of those subjects or who need to express their concerns? And it may not be racism, it may be unemployment, it may be anything to do with the lived experience of those around us. So the issue here is active agency. That's my quote about. So we're looking at the relevance about these issues in terms of human relevance. And my big concern, as may be obvious, is with active agency and also with the museum's theory of change in relation to those people with whom it's working. So how does the museum see itself in terms of its role and its responsibility for persuading anyone of anything? Is it, and I've quoted many times in papers I've written, a moment at the Museum of London where a Chinese woman stood in the room and said to the museum director and to senior museum staff, and she was a community partner from an organization working with the museum, she said, hang on a minute, what is it for? What do you want to do to me? What needs changing? What is your conception of me that needs improving? So how is this a partnership if you are looking at me in that way? And if you're looking at me in that way, is that then written into everything we do in terms of the exhibitions and how we interact with those people we're working with? What values underpin the museum's exhibition strategy, and are they part of the institution's commitment to social change? And do we know, have we examined the values behind our exhibition plans and ideas before we ever get to speaking with the architect? Do we know why we want to do what we're doing? And part of the workshop that I'm doing tomorrow, I'm not drumming up business, I think it's already very full, is to look at how we reflect on these processes as professionals in our own practice. Are we curating social issues and concerns on behalf of our audiences, or might it be more appropriate if we collaborate with them in actively co-producing exhibitions of relevance to them? The questions we have to ask ourselves of exhibitions are, who and what is intended to change as a result of the museum's exhibitionary strategies? Who's being persuaded, how and why? Who produces the exhibition, and who's the intended consumer? Who's the active agent? Who's the passive beneficiary? And is there opportunity for different views, for conflict, and a means for effective challenge and debate? I'm increasingly being introduced as the person who likes conflict. It isn't actually that I'm looking for conflict. I don't know how you leave out conflict if you're actively engaging with people. It may not happen, but how is it right to keep it outside? The Chinese woman had asked what it was that the museum had wished to do to or for her. In other words, what changes did the museum wish to bring about in this individual? Frequently, the best indication of how these relations are configured is stated within our own language. And I have an obsession with language, how we describe what we do to ourselves. So it was fantastically interesting to have that opportunity to speak to museum professionals when we were going around here in Denmark to see what kind of language are people using. Yeah, so I'll just leave those up for you to look at. These are the kinds of questions that my research in the last couple of years has been trying to address. How am I doing? Okay? Yeah. Okay, now you can say that people don't want to be shaken and stirred, or is it stirred and shaken? Shaken and stirred from James Bond. People don't want to be shaken and stirred by when they come into a museum. But actually research has shown that that's not true. That's an assumption by the institution. There were two major research projects conducted between 2001 and 2004, exhibitions as contested sites, the roles of museums in contemporary societies, that was funded by the Australian Research Council, and Contested Sites Canada, funded by the Canadian Museums Association. And it was looking to move beyond the specifics of exhibition controversies and theoretical rhetoric to examine the relevance, plausibility, and practical operation of a range of museums as civic centres for engagement of topics of contemporary relevance and importance. So to shortcut to the answer, did people want it? Yes, they resoundingly did. There were questions related to the museum's social social responsibilities and civic roles. The surprise to many, based on the results of both the Canadian and Australian studies, was that overwhelmingly audiences want to be challenged more than they currently are, and that they see museums having a social responsibility to take a leading role as social and political activists to engage in discussion about bringing about change. And the question ended, are museums ready and willing to provide? Are museums willing to take up this central civil role in civil society? As James Clifford, who is a very eminent museologist, said, if we don't do it, who will? Who is going to take up this responsibility? So there is resistance within our institutions, and one of the outcomes of the research projects in the last few years in the UK about what needed to happen so that museums could take on that responsibility more fully was that museums had to look at their own organizations as the biggest obstacle to change. Because while you have education departments or public programming or whatever you call it sitting on the margins of the organization, and it not being taken on board as something that is the responsibility of the whole institution, it will never work. So in some cases, and we saw some cases here in this country too, it became clear to the director and senior management who were committed to the museum taking this role that they actually had to engage in whole organizational change. There's a huge role here for supporting that through the cultural agencies, and in the UK that's been seen to be the case and is being supported by the Arts Council, the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Museums Association and other big funding agencies, looking at if we need to do this more effectively, then actually we need to look at our organization as the problem. How do we address that? What do we do? There is if you're interested in looking at how that's happening on the ground, there's a very interesting project called Our Museum, and it's a very live debate running as an experiment across 10 institutions in the UK right now. Some of them very large, like Glasgow museums. Okay, so where are we? So the fundamental question, it was one we asked every time we went to visit a museum in Denmark, what is the institution there to do? Is it there to address the social realities that surround it? Is it its responsibility? And if the gallery or museum can't bring itself to talk about the difficult issues, situations, interactions and relations that are happening, then what relevance do these very fancy new buildings have? We're looking at, people are now talking about an activist practice, a rights-based practice, where people have a right to engage with institutions in a different way. That was the human rights. Museums dwelling in the boundary between advocacy and scholarship. I think the Science Museum is a really interesting model of that, actually. And moving away from what I have termed in museums empowerment light. When we bring people in and we call it participation, and actually it is sitting in on our agenda and getting them to sign off on the museum's agenda. Nobody's fooled by that. This was, if you're interested too, this was the research project, Whose Cake Is It Anyway, that Paul Hamlin funded, that I did across the UK, looking at museums and how deep did participation go. I'm very happy to note that some of the language that we challenged in that review is now in the bricks and mortar of museums in the UK. I hear back people saying to me all the time, we have to move away from beneficiaries, and this is music to my ears. So again, this notion of a rights-based practice. I was very happy to see the Danish Museum Citizenship Project, and I met some of the colleagues who are part of that in Copenhagen last week, and we began a really interesting conversation about what citizenship actually means in each of their institutions. If you engage with active citizenship, what does that look like in relation to? So I think there are interesting conversations going on in Denmark. Another thing that, again, if you're interested, we very deliberately looked at how do you engage with conflict. You know, and this is a really difficult thing. Most curatorial staff or educators are not trained in how we engage with conflict in a museum. When you run into, we say we want multiple views, what if they don't agree? And what if they don't agree with passion? How do we facilitate that? So this is also available online, this publication, and it gives examples from a series of museums who have done that, who have been facing up to that across the country. And you'll see some of these references I'm putting here are within that. And it includes facilitation skills for dealing with these kinds of difficult situations if we want the museum to truly be a forum. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up now. And there's a lot going on with that you can have a look at online. So again, what do we talk about learning. What about the learning museum? If we don't learn from our own practice and these kinds of difficulties and reflect on them, we won't learn. In fact, we learn best from the things that don't work, as we know, if we're brave enough to face up to them. Okay. So to finally wrap up, in terms of museum exhibitions, the point is to engage all those concerned as social actors engaged in a reflexive process to critically understand and transform their world. This is the opportunity we want people to have and to engage with us in some form of real dialogue. This has never been more precious, and I entirely agree with James Clifford. It is our responsibility to take it on. Thank you.